Before we get on with this video, I would like to just say, while this video is humorous and tongue-in-cheek in nature, suicide is not funny. If you are having suicidal ideations and feelings, please call this hotline or seek a mental health professional or reach out to anybody that you know that can help you. That being said, even if you are and you're watching this video all the way through, I hope that the absurdity of the concept of suicide and maybe how funny this video helps you to realize that life is worth living. And with that, let's get on with the video. LowTierGod has been an interesting spectacle to behold over the past decade. His infamous reputation preceded him in the fighting game community, but just as recent as of late 2021, mainstream meme culture caught attention of one of his more extreme rants. "You should kill yourself now" pervaded our meme viewing platforms for weeks, which in turn gave LowTierGod more exposure. Due to this exposure, however, LowTierGod's reputation and stature have come under heavier scrutiny. People are finding out more and more about the questionable aspects of his personality and how he presents himself. While people have taken the opportunity to discuss him in a more analytical manner and examine his character carefully on YouTube, I'm going to seize this opportunity to do something that no one would have had thought to do otherwise. I'm going to figure out where LowTierGod's philosophical position on suicide is through examining his words in the speech and examining a myriad of different philosophies. I'll also tackle the absurdity of telling somebody to kill themselves, especially with how people have been doing it on the internet as of late. Before we get into philosophical ramblings, we must first understand the context of the rant itself. In the clip from a few years ago, LowTierGod is frustrated at a chat member or multiple chat members that keep resurfacing on different accounts after getting banned in Twitch. LowTierGod's threshold for chat members that constantly troll him is as low as the Mariana Trench, which is often why he makes a spectacle out of himself in the situation. In this case, he takes it to the ultimate extreme. Let's examine the rant.
"You are worthless, bitch-ass nigga. Your life literally is as valuable as a summer ant. I'm just gonna stump you. You're gonna keep coming back. I'm gonna seal up all my cracks. You're gonna keep coming back. Why? Because you keep smelling the syrup. You worthless bitch-ass nigga. You're gonna stay on my until you die. You serve no purpose in life. Your purpose in life is to be in my stream sucking on my daily. Your purpose in life is to be in that chat blowing daily. Your life is nothing. You serve zero purpose. You should kill yourself now and give somebody else a piece of that oxygen and ozone layer that's covered up so that we can breathe inside this blue trapped bubble. Because what are you here for? To worship me? Kill yourself. I mean that with 100%, with 1,000%.
LowTierGod equates the act of fellatio, mostly attributed to his chat member constantly screwing with him, as a fruitless endeavor. The amount of time and effort spent on trying to agitate him in his streams is seen as an act worse than death. Due to that being the crux of LowTierGod's value judgments on what humans should and shouldn't spend their time on, he ultimately comes to the bold and impolite suggestion: you should kill yourself now. I'm starting to realize that this getup, this outfit is a little too formal. One moment. Alright. If you spend time trying to rough him up in the chat, you are not worthy of the oxygen he kindly shares with you in what he calls this blue trapped bubble. I figure that he is referring to the Earth with this expression, but it's such a weird, obtuse way to say it. The man is so tilted he can't even say Earth right. LowTierGod doesn't see any value in your life whatsoever. There isn't a hint of irony or sarcasm. You're wasting your time. It would be beneficial for you to take your life rather than live it. You are actively wasting oxygen for everyone else. LowTierGod is obviously extra emotional about the situation, but let's examine the targeted chat member for a moment. Let's assume that this chat member spends all their time in the chat harassing and stream sniping LowTierGod. What value do they actually hold in society, but more importantly, to themselves? Are they not wasting their own precious time developing themselves, finding a fulfilling passion, or seeking enlightenment? I might be giving LowTierGod an inch here, but I'm not going to let him take a mile. The key word is should, not to go kill yourself. LowTierGod is merely suggesting that your existence is worthless. He's speculating upon whether your existence is even worth living for coming in his chat and engaging digital fellatio with him. But LowTierGod isn't the only thing that defines this rant. We must examine it as a meme as well. From about the fall to the end of 2021, this image was spread around the internet like wildfire. This image was concocted around August of 2021, and eventually the spread of the meme caught on when currently suspended account DP on WakeUp posted it in late September. For those who don't know, the name DP on WakeUp refers to a tactic used by players in fighting games where they input Dragon Punch when they wake up after a hard knockdown. This tactic is usually used by cowards, losers, and freaks. From that point, the meme's proliferation created thousands of edits of the image and video. The meme quickly outgrew LowTierGod's reputation, arguably adding to his immense infamy. At its most popular point, the meme was ultimately a risk-free way of telling people online to kill themselves, usually over mundane things or just bad takes. It was especially big on Twitter, considering Twitter's very strict use of the word kill on anything that can be perceived as a threat. Memes have been able to develop a nuanced way of communicating completely by visual stimulus. Personally, I found the meme to be the most interesting when you crop off most of it. Going out of your way to half-ass tell somebody to kill themselves is infinitely funnier. The actual image itself is so striking that it automatically embeds itself into our mimetic collective conscious. The absurdity of telling someone to kill themselves immediately is mostly why it became a meme. It's such a vitriolic and extreme response, especially given the context of the meme. Memes like this one are cropping up more and more to evade website censors and guidelines. Algorithms on websites don't actually reflect human intent. So if you want to tell somebody to give themselves a haircut with a shotgun, this image of LowTierGod is a great substitute. In about 20 years, we might have enough memes to develop a language entirely based around them, like speaking in metaphors, verbally and visually. Of course, this would be the worst outcome for the future because we would sound exactly like the Tamarians from Star Trek.
Rage face and troll face on the front page.
That's how you communicate, isn't it? By citing example. By metaphor.
Big Chungus, his mouth open.
Open.
Sneed! Formerly Chucks!
This might just be me, but as of February 2022, I don't see the meme as often as you'd think. I'm not sure if it's due to LowTierGod's toxicity coming to light or that platforms are discouraging its use. The half-life of memes are getting shorter and shorter, so eventually we'll see a return of this meme in some capacity. But now that we have a better understanding of LowTierGod, the speech, and the meme it spawned, let's look at some philosophies and see what distinction LowTierGod, an astute intellectual, falls under.
So I don't believe in I'm a strong believer that toilets are not meant to be pissed in, only urinals. Piss splashes all over the seat. It's disgusting. It's unsanitary for a dude to piss in a toilet. So preferably I use a bottle. Whenever I have a bottle laying around, that's what I use. I get to aim the slit right in the hole, and I get to urinate with no splashing, no crazy shit. It's just I urine, pour it out in the toilet, bleach the bottle, I'm good.
Plato and Socrates are arguably the most common and well-known philosophers, seeing as both helped to define Western philosophy as we know it. Socrates once stated this about suicide: "A man who is one of the god's possessions should not kill himself until the god sends some compulsion upon him, as he sends compulsion upon us at present." Socrates only sees suicide as permissible if a god tells us to do it. Ancient Greece and their formative thinkers were enamored with the concept of self-termination, contemplating the ideas in length. Suicide to them is only justified when someone's character or public perception is tainted beyond salvation. Regardless, suicide is often viewed as cowardice by classical philosophers. Some, however, considered it a heroic act depending on the circumstances. I can't see myself putting LowTierGod in this category because he doesn't really pay attention to the public life or moral reputation of those in his chat. I mean, how can you? It's pretty impossible. Nor does he really consider it a heroic act as thinkers from ancient Greece once believed. The sins and transgressions of the chat members, in LowTierGod's eyes, will be ever present in his mind. There will be no respect for those who should already have killed themselves. LowTierGod wouldn't honor someone like Young Feet God for sparing extra oxygen. It's just implausible. Stoicism is the classical belief that virtue is the highest good that is based on knowledge. All other forms of pain and pleasure aren't important, and their reverence should be paid to virtue. The Stoics are often contrasted to the classical school of thought in that Stoics believed that there are natural advantages one must have to live a good life. If one doesn't have these things, such as a debilitating disability or handicap, suicide might be justified, regardless of the person's moral composition. If it's especially debilitating, suicide won't affect your moral standing either. By modern standards, it's morbid to suggest that suicide is an appropriate answer in some circumstances. The continued effort to mitigate those with physical and mental disadvantages by way of technology and medicine almost makes Stoic philosophy null and void when talking about suicide. This wasn't the case during the time Stoics were developing their ideas. Life was a precious commodity that at any time could be shortened or snuffed out. The comfort of modern healthcare doesn't alleviate some of our more modern anxieties about health. Cicero, one of the most influential Stoic philosophers, acknowledges this conundrum relative to his experience and time period. When a man's circumstances contain a preponderance of things in accordance with nature, it's appropriate for him to remain alive. When he possesses or sees in prospect a majority of the contrary things, it is appropriate for him to depart from life. Even for the foolish, who are also miserable, it is appropriate for them to remain alive if they possess a predominance of those things which we pronounce to be in accordance with nature. We can't assume that the chat members in LowTierGod have these disabilities. Despite LowTierGod's certainty in his voice, I don't think he does either. It would be intellectually dishonest for him to assume anyway. Knowing LowTierGod in his infinite wisdom, I know that he wouldn't make that assumption.
Listen. So here's what you do. You kick back. Make sure when you get top, the woman's not in front, head's not here, she's not there. When you get top, make sure when you're laying down, she's giving you top sideways. Therefore, your leg could be like this while you're getting top. Reach behind. Of course, she has to be, bottom's got to be off. Make sure you can reach behind, and while she's topping you, you can take these two fingers and play. You know, play around with the vagina, play around with the clitoris. Insert, pull out. While she's too busy topping you, you take some whiffs.
Stoicism is about being able to live with the things out of your control and not let said things out of your control dictate how you live your life. It might be that LowTierGod needs to learn from the Stoics, as turning off your chat once in a while might be a great idea. Stoicism has more of an enduring response to suffering in that they view pain as more of an abstraction, as something we conceptualize to fear. Stoicism doesn't seek to reduce suffering, but to become as indifferent to it as possible. There's no easy answer or solution to many of the woes of life. Considering the Stoics' position on suicide, LowTierGod doesn't just fail to meet this position on suicide through Stoicism, but would outright fail to even be considered one to begin with. In fact, I'd consider him anti-Stoic in the way that he deals with some minor inconveniences, annoying chat members, and, most importantly, losing in video games. I suppose if he was a Stoic, he'd be way less interesting to watch, and we wouldn't be here making this video. Absurdism in philosophy is the absolute rejection of any rational explanation for any meaning or phenomena in life. Albert Camus posits that the concept of the absurd, which is the dichotomy between the human desire for our value and our uncertainty to find it. Absurdists and existentialists of this era do not often ponder the moral implications of suicide, but whether it's an appropriate response to the absurdism of life. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus illustrates Greek mythological figure Sisyphus infinitely pushing a boulder up a hill. The boulder would get to the top and roll back down. This normally would be seen as a massive waste of time, but Camus argues that this symbolic action is analogous to life itself. Despite the futility of it all, we continue to push the boulder. It's never a heroic act. Sisyphus tries to imagine himself happy. Despite this sounding nihilistic, Camus wants us to use this philosophical position to stave off our lust to off ourselves constantly by embracing the absurdity of life. Camus sees living life as a rebellious act against our existential dilemmas. Even in the most dire of situations, the act of living itself is virtuous. Absurdists do not, in most cases, condone the act of suicide. If the act is virtuous, such as a sacrifice for the better or knowing you have an inescapable horrible fate, such as having to actually read The Stranger by Camus, then yes, you should absolutely kill yourself. Sartre believed that suicide is antithetical to what he considered the ideal state of humanity, which is to be able to consider and contemplate our own existence. Life in many ways is already a living death that we must think our way through. From our assessment of LowTierGod, I'm willing to bet that he wouldn't fall under the absurdist category. The crux of LowTierGod's argument is that you have no value, even in your summer ant of an existence. Even if he wanted you to kill yourself, he wouldn't actively encourage you to seek meaning, even in the most menial circumstances. Again, you're completely wasting his time and oxygen, so why even give you any intellectual stimulus? Utilitarianism might be the simplest and pragmatic of the positions on this list. Utilitarianism is all about the justification of what is right for most people or the most useful in a situation. The issue is that utilitarianism can be used for and against suicide. An example of this being someone ending their own life due to constant depression. An example of this being somebody ending their life due to constant depression. While the suffering has ended for the individual, grieving and pain for a group of people who loved that person might outweigh the moral reasons for committing suicide in the first place. However, if that said person has a disability or abnormality that prevents them from living life in general, their suffering could be argued to be greater than a group of people willing to prolong that suffering. In terms of LowTierGod's situation, is the suicide of that one chat member justified to end the irrational temper of LowTierGod? Let's assume that the chat member's value to society is basically nothing. Let's assume that the chat member's value to society can be empirically proved to be basically nothing. Is suicide for that one member still permissible? LowTierGod's value to society is also debatable. Besides a job behind the scenes that we never know about, all he does is play video games, piss in bottles, and stream. It certainly stands to reason that even with LowTierGod's judgment of his chat members, that he is not a utilitarian. Unlike other philosophies on this list, idealism mostly operates under epistemology, which is the study of knowledge itself. Idealism, or Kant's transcendental idealism, takes the position of seeing knowledge as more than just observations from our senses, but examining how our individual minds process information. Kant was opposed to suicide as it is the termination of our rational wills, which is the source of our moral authority and perspective. Violating our rational will is antithetical to our existence outright. To annihilate the subject of morality in one's person is to root out the existence of morality itself from the world as far as one can, even though morality is an end in itself. Consequently, disposing of oneself as a mere means to some discretionary end is debasing humanity in one's person. For Schopenhauer, who is famous for his pessimism and his beliefs, was strongly opposed to suicide. Unlike Kant, he rejected the moral objectionability of suicide. Instead, he saw suicide as somewhat of a misguided desire for freedom, and that giving it would affirm our will's desire. To Schopenhauer, human pursuits and desires were often cast in a negative light, hence his notorious pessimism. Here's a quote to illustrate that, followed by another quote from him about suicide. All satisfaction, or what is commonly called happiness, is really and essentially always negative only, and never positive. It's not a gratification which comes to us originally and of itself, but it always must be the satisfaction of a wish. For desire, that is to say, want, is the precedent condition of every pleasure, but with the satisfaction, the desire and therefore the pleasure cease, and so the satisfaction or gratification can never be more than deliverance from pain, from a want. Such is not only every actual and evident suffering, but also every desire whose importunity disturbs our peace, and indeed even the deadening boredom that makes existence a burden to us. Suicide quote as follows: "It will generally be found that, as soon as the terrors of life reach the point at which they outweigh the terrors of death, a man will put an end to his life. But the terrors of death offer considerable resistance. They stand like a sentinel at the gates leading out of this world. Perhaps there is no man alive who would have not already put an end to his life. If this end had been of a purely negative character, a sudden stoppage of existence, there is nothing positive about it. It is the destruction of the body, and a man shrinks from that, because his body is the manifestation of the will to live. Friedrich Nietzsche, arguably the most well-known modern philosopher, who is also sometimes a pessimist, rejected the moralization of suicide but found it to be sometimes rational. Nietzsche saw suicide as a way of lending meaning to someone's life in a meaningless world. That is, of course, if the person lacked any meaning to begin with. These more modern philosophical positions on suicide might be a bit denser than what we can deduct from LowTierGod's ramblings. What we can assume is that if LowTierGod was aligned with any of these beliefs, he would have worded his angry, impassioned response differently. LowTierGod doesn't go into the desire of the person who should kill themselves. In fact, it's entirely about the moral implications of them being alive that affect others. It has nothing to do with the will. LowTierGod transcends the need to engage in such pedantic discourse anyway. Well, I'm officially lost. I'm not sure exactly where LowTierGod really falls under with any of this. It's a stupid question to begin with, but if we look exclusively at the speech itself, it's easy to conclude that he may be utilitarian. Under more scrutiny, we can see that he does not look to better society for others. But there is one philosopher that LowTierGod is somewhat comparable to. Diogenes the Cynic was a Greek philosopher that jerked off in a bucket in public areas. It's all coming together. Diogenes was unashamed and without embarrassment in how he conducted himself in public. This was reflective of his philosophical ideas. He thought having the manners and upholding one's status through good behavior were traits of dishonest people. Diogenes sought extreme truthfulness and transparency out of people. Diogenes found that in order to live, one's natural needs need to be met, and what is natural for some may be ugly and too forward. The impulsive anger of LowTierGod is analogous to the extreme truthfulness Diogenes was searching for. The impulsive anger of LowTierGod is analogous to the extreme truthfulness Diogenes was searching for. LowTierGod's affect is that of pure, raw, unfiltered emotions. Telling someone to go commit suicide is the most extreme and raw form of anger. There is no pretense or any holding back in your expression at that point. Is LowTierGod more truthful to himself than you or me? He clearly isn't expressing any regret after telling somebody to kill themselves. While Diogenes doesn't have anything documented exactly about suicide, cynicism itself doesn't condone suicide either. It might find it permissible under certain circumstances like Stoicism, but ultimately the desire to commit suicide would be wrong in a cynic's worldview. Cynics valued self-sufficiency and independence over anything else. The end of one's life is not to be seen as pleasurable, but virtuous, which is exactly the same as the Stoics. Letting go of your possessions and letting the natural world envelop you is what mattered most to the Cynics. LowTierGod pissing in bottles instead of a toilet while flaunting that he does it is a rejection of modern society. LowTierGod's colorful vernacular and disregard for his own image could be analogous to Diogenes. There we have it. LowTierGod is the fighting game Diogenes. Throughout the history of philosophy, suicide has, at the very least, been argued as permissible. As far as I know, there are no outright arguments in favor of committing the act, except if you count LowTierGod's unique perspective on the matter. But the voluntary termination of one's own existence isn't really intellectually justifiable. Our certainty of what comes after death makes it impossible to morally justify the act. And it's curious that LowTierGod is sort of a cult of personality type figure. The charisma that he has is often inverted for him most of the time, often working against him. The original rant just goes to show how highly he thinks of himself, his stream, and his gameplay. Of course, we can chalk this up to poor anger management, but I think his ego is so inflated that his value judgments on other people's lives are valid. That itself is almost funnier than the meme. This is the end slate. I don't know if this is the longest video I've ever done. This video is kind of a mess. I kind of just cobbled it together. It's maybe the weirdest concept of a video I've ever done, but I think it's maybe the funniest. I don't know if I'll ever do something like this again. Let me know thoroughly in the comments what you think of something like this. And yeah, stick around. I'm going to be doing shorter videos a little bit more. I'm going to continue doing longer videos more down the line, but I have a lot of ideas that only facilitate short run time. So stick around, and look out for my April Fool's block. Some things are going to be happening there. All right, guys, thanks for watching.